Everyone. Good morning. Welcome. Hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. Question today. This is a question I always like to ask every year. It's always interesting to see what people come up with as answers. But what for you when you were little was a movie, a TV show, or something else minor or silly that scared you as a kid? Like for me, for example, it was the bad guy in the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like Who Framed Roger Rabbit's like a just a PG movie, but the villain in that movie was terrifying as a child. Andy going with Barney, fair, fair. Jason catching a piece of The Walking Dead at a young age. That'll definitely do it. Ooh, Scooby Doo villains for Jorgen. That's fair. Some of them a little creepy. Anyone else got something that when you were little, like totally freaked you out? Like the flying monkeys from The Wizard of Oz, that's, like, always a classic answer to this question. So feel free to share anything in the chat. But we'll go ahead and click over to the vocabulary so people can start jotting that down. We are starting Unit 7 this week, which is the final unit of the semester. And Unit 7 is really kind of taking a deep dive into the different rights and freedoms we have as Americans. And so we'll kind of introduce that concept today. We'll look at some constitutional protections that we have. Yesterday, you should have gotten an email from me that had both the Unit 7 study guide, but then also a study guide for what will essentially be the final exam for this class, which is not going to be like this big gigantic test or anything like that. It's taking just a couple of questions from the citizenship test that immigrants need to take when they want to become U.S. citizens, and it's covering very basic things like what are the three branches of government, what is the Constitution, things like that. So it shouldn't be anything too big to stress about, but you do have that study guide that you can use as a resource to help prepare for that assessment as needed. And then give me one moment here just to send out the email to those who are running late today. All right. And then real quick, want to answer this student question, uh, which is an interesting one of changing perspectives across the generations of Americans. Um, Basically, the student asking, why might older generations have a more positive or optimistic view of the United States compared to your generation potentially having a more negative view of the United States or this fall from grace. And there is some, and Keegan, thanks for letting me know. There is some data to suggest that younger Americans today have a more negative view of the United States. The reasons for that are probably complicated. We probably couldn't point to just one thing. Definitely one that's going to play a factor is internet and social media. Just the reality is negative views on things tend to get a lot more attention on social media. They tend to get shared more. They tend to get more views. Um, but if a person is constantly watching or sharing negative or critical or sarcastic views on everything, that's probably going to result in a more negative, sarcastic, perhaps even bitter view towards things. Part of it is also just national and world events. Um, the United States has been going through challenging times. You know, you guys essentially would have been born in the middle of the biggest economic crisis for the United States since the Great Depression, what's called the Great Recession. So that's obviously going to create tension and anxiety in the United States. Um, more recent things then with COVID, George Floyd protests, political controversies. Um, that's also obviously going to shape a person's views if, that's kind of what is going on in the country as they're kind of maturing into, adulthood. So I think that probably has a plays a piece in it as well. Um, but let's go ahead and digging into Unit 7 then. So I want to begin with a little bit of brainstorming here. Because as I mentioned, Unit 7 is all about exploring what are the different protected rights and freedoms we have as American citizens. And so I want you to take just a couple of minutes and try to think of, write out as many things as you can think of that you believe or you have a good hunch are protected rights or freedoms here in the United States. So anything that you think or you maybe at one point have heard is a protected right or freedom, included in your list, and then send it to me through the questions and answers chat. So we'll just take a couple of minutes here. We'll come back at 9:26 and I'll kind of compile everyone's list. So again, as a private chat message, send me anything you can come up with that you think or you've heard is potentially a protected right or freedom here in the United States. And you got about a minute left to finish up your list and send it to me if you haven't already. All right. Let me go ahead and grab what I have here so far. If you're still typing up a list, that's fine. Finish it up. Want to hear from you. But we got a pretty good list of things to get us started here. And as I was reading through everything, I didn't see anything that was just kind of made up of like, oh, well, no, that's not actually a freedom. Um, all of you were pulling from things that in one way or another do exist in the United States. One of the things that can be challenging, though, is that there isn't exactly just one document or one location that clearly explains all the different rights or freedoms we have as U.S. citizens. Um, a good amount of them, a lot of the things you listed here, come from the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. That would include things like freedom of speech, the right to assembly, freedom to religion, freedom of the press, um, right to bear arms, Second Amendment, uh, fair trial, that would be in the Bill of Rights. So a lot of our freedoms do get spelled out in the Bill of Rights, but we can also pull from other areas as well. The comment of, what would ultimately be the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that comes from the Declaration of Independence. Talking about equality of marriage rights, that really comes through Supreme Court decisions over the decades. The Supreme Court has clarified that, for example, the right to marriage can't be denied because of race. In the past, for example, if people were of different races, they couldn't get married until the Supreme Court clarified that. More recently, the Supreme Court clarifying that marriage rights also exist to same-sex couples. But as Jorgen notes, because those were clarifications made by the Supreme Court, they could also theoretically be undone by the Supreme Court. And some LGBTQ organizations are concerned about that as the Supreme Court has shifted in a more conservative direction, including making decisions regarding abortion rights, could also theoretically result in changes regarding rulings regarding marriage rights as well. Because yes, as Jason notes, in many states across the country, you are seeing new legislation that is being passed. Now, just because a state law is proposed or even passed doesn't always mean it takes effect, because those laws can get challenged in court. They kind of have to make their way through the legal system. They sometimes get struck down. So that is an ever evolving, ongoing process. But it's a really good example of the fact that our rights as Americans aren't always necessarily set in stone as we would maybe think. That as different issues get brought before the courts and the courts make rulings, those rulings can either result in an expansion or a shrinkage in our rights. And so with Unit 7, focusing on our rights as Americans, I think a really important question to ask is why even bother? Why might it be important to study and learn what our rights are as American citizens? Or if it helps you think about it in reverse, what would potentially be the issue if no one in America knew what their rights were? Yeah, Jorgen.
I want to say it has to deal with the people trying to protect their rights, and if people don't know what their rights were, they could be getting arrested for basically any no reason at all. Like, hey, you're a different color, you're arrested, or something like that. And then it's like, oh, you like that person? You like that same person who's the same sex as you? No, you're arrested. But it's basically saying that people who do know what their rights are trying to get their who we know how to study our rights, so we know how to deal with public interactions with everyday objects, with everyday people, and know we know how to deal with the police if we ever get into trouble. And basically, I have the right to remain silent, and that is it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ali, glad you can make it. Thanks for letting me know. So yeah, Jorgen raises a really good point that if no one in America knew what their rights were, well, then that would make it very easy for the government to ignore or abuse those rights because no one would know otherwise or be able to challenge the government at that point. So yeah, uh, I would argue a really important part of taking a government class is learning what actually are your rights as a US citizen, as well as some of the limitations to your rights, as we're going to get into when we talk about in more detail things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech. No right in the United States is 100% absolute. There are always certain circumstances or limitations to things, and we'll dig more into that in future class connects. Uh, But to begin our discussion of rights, we go back to our old philosopher friend John Locke, who came up with the concept of natural rights in his philosophical writings. And again, John Locke was read by a lot of the founding fathers, so a lot of Locke's philosophy kind of made its way into the United States. Um, so, what again are we saying about something if we describe it as being natural? What does that mean, or what comes to mind when you hear that word natural? Could include kind of thinking about something that just kind of commonly exists. What else? If we describe something as being natural, where does it come from? Yeah, it comes from nature as the root word. So it's not artificial. If we describe something being natural, it's something that just has kind of automatically existed or comes from nature. And so Locke described a set of natural rights. Um, Life, liberty, and property is specifically what Locke identified. And he basically argued these are rights that automatically exist for people on the day they are born, in a state of nature. So, for example, if you took people and you like wiped their memories and put them on a deserted island, they were living in a total state of nature, they would just automatically have these rights. They would have the right to live, to continue to exist. They would have the right of liberty to go about living their life however they want, and they would have the right of property as they're building tools and shelters. That's their property. They own it. They control it. So Locke basically argued that there are certain rights that kind of just automatically exist for people when they're born. And yeah, Jorgen, right here, that's on the slide. They're things that just kind of automatically exist, or they're inalienable, meaning they can't be denied. So, thinking about today here in the United States, then, liberty, for example, means, being able to go live your life how you want to go live it. Do we have 100% total liberty in the United States? Can everyone in America live their life absolutely however they want? Yeah, I would agree. No. As Jorgen, for example, notes, there are some rules or restrictions we have to follow for safety reasons. Or, for example, if I decided I really just wanted to start walking into other people's homes and taking their stuff, am I allowed to do that under the concept of the natural right to liberty? Is that something we can do as Americans? Just walk into other people's homes and start taking their stuff because that's what we feel like to do? No, of course not. That would be theft and vandalism. It would be a violation of their property rights at that point. Like, okay, yes, I may be expressing my right to liberty, but in the process, I'm violating their right to property. And so here in the United States, we ultimately do not have unrestricted access to our natural rights. And that goes back to that idea of the social contract, which we talked about all the way back in Unit 1, but I'm going to guess we could use a refresher. It's that idea that being part of a society or a country, we essentially agree to give up some of our natural rights. So, for example, I can't just go walking into other people's homes and taking their stuff. That is ultimately a limitation on my liberty, technically speaking. Or, for example, when I'm driving a car, I have to obey speed limits. I have to obey stop signs and stoplights. I have to wear a seatbelt, whether I want to or not. But that goes back to Jorgen's concept of safety. We agree as a society to some restrictions on our freedom or our liberty as part of the social contract, but we get something out of it in return. One is safety. Yeah, I don't have the right to go into other people's homes and take their stuff, but that also means they don't have the right to come into my home and take my stuff. So I get a sense of safety and security out of that. In addition to that, as part of being in a social contract with one another, we then get access to civil rights and liberties. And with this term civil, kind of has the same root as the word civilization. So it's the idea of being part of a organized society. We're not just wild people living on a deserted island. We're part of a country. We're part of a society. And so being part of that society, we have access to civil rights and liberties. And so civil rights and liberties are rights that are gained through being members of society. And so a lot of the things you guys were listing would be examples of civil rights and liberties. Things like marriage rights. If we were just wild animals living on an island, we would have no concept of marriage. So there would be no marriage rights. That's part of living in a society. Same thing with freedom of religion. Again, religion is an element of living in a society. That's part of our civil rights and liberties. The right to bear arms, freedom of the press, freedom of trial, or the right to a fair trial. Those are all things that are really important to us, but they're only things that exist because we live in a society. Again, if we were, wild animals living out in the wilderness, those things wouldn't exist. We wouldn't care about them. Now, one area of the K-12 course that I don't think does a very good job is explaining civil liberties and civil rights. In some cases, it almost uses those terms interchangeably. And to be fair, a lot of Americans do. Most Americans could not tell you the difference between civil liberties and civil rights, but they technically are separate things. And so I wouldn't feel like I'm doing my job if I at least didn't briefly let you know that those are technically different things, even though people often use the terms interchangeably. So civil liberties largely come from the Bill of Rights. That would include things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and they are essentially limitations on government power. They are the things that tell government, you can't touch that. You can't mess with that. You got to let people do their thing. So, for example, freedom of the press or freedom of religion is telling government, you can't force people to follow a certain religion. People are free to follow the religion of their choice. That is ultimately limiting government power. That's telling the government, hey, here's an aspect of life that you can't mess with, you can't touch. So civil liberties limit government's power by creating, protected freedoms for us, and telling the government, you can't touch that, you can't mess with that. Civil rights, on the other hand, require government action to be in effect, because civil rights refer to issues of equality, making sure that Americans are treated equally and fairly under the law, which largely comes from the 14th Amendment, which we'll dig into more detail in a later Class Connect. But basically, the 14th Amendment says that all Americans should receive equal protection under the law. But, just a quick reflection on U.S. history. Historically, have all Americans been treated equally under the law? Or can you think of any examples of people who, especially in the past, maybe weren't treated equally under the law? So sure, yeah. Thinking about George Floyd or African Americans more broadly as a group would be a historical example of a group of Americans that have not been treated equally under the law. Things like segregation, Jim Crow laws in the South, things like that. We could also point to women historically not being treated fairly under the law, not receiving equal right to vote, not enjoying the same access to education and employment. The topic of abortion, absolutely an ongoing discussion we have in the United States. And then definitely looking at the LGBTQ community. Um, the gay rights movement fighting for equality for the LGBTQ community. Um, and so those are situations where you had unfairness and ultimately required government to step in to help enforce equality. Things like the Civil Rights Act, the 19th Amendment, ensuring that women have the right to vote, the Supreme Court making rulings to guarantee certain rights for LGBTQ members, like marriage rights. Things we'll kind of explore in future class connects. So when we talk about civil rights, that is usually requiring the government to step up and address an issue of unfairness. Just like the civil rights movement, with people like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Diane Nash, um, putting pressure on the government to address an issue of unfairness that was existed. So, civil liberties limits what the government can do, says, hey, that's hands off for the government, don't touch that. Civil rights is all about equality. It is bringing in the government to protect against discrimination. So let's do a quick pulse check. Let's see if we can identify the difference here. So I'll bring up the polling tools in just a second. Which of the following provides equal protection under the law? Would that be natural rights, civil liberties, civil rights, or natural liberties? Go ahead and use the polling tools to make your selection. And as always, no penalty if you get it wrong. Go ahead and take an educated guess if you're not sure. We'll obviously review. And if you're on a cell phone, you can send me your answer choice through the questions and answers chat so I know that you're here. So we have quite a few people on cell phones today. Good. Got responses from over half of you already. Still looking for a response from Destiny, Gracie, Hannah, Larissa, Brensley, Anthony, Noah, and Tegan. Give me just one moment to jot those names down. All right. And nicely done. We are largely in agreement that this would best match up with civil rights, and you would be correct. So if we're talking about ensuring equality before the law, making sure people are treated fairly under the law, that's tied into civil rights. And again, an easy way to maybe remember that is to think about the civil rights movement, which again, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, fighting for equal rights for African Americans in the United States. So when we're talking about civil rights, that's all about equality, making sure people are being treated fairly under the law. All right. Then which of the following limits government power? Would that be natural rights, civil liberties, civil rights, or natural liberties? Okay, good. And if you're not sure, go ahead and take an educated guess at this time, just so I can kind of see where you're leaning. But good. Um, Nice to see people are paying attention. No one picked civil rights because we just had that on the last question. So good to see. Um, we ultimately had a tie between natural rights and civil liberties. And ultimately, the right answer would be civil liberties because here in the United States, as well as every country on the planet, essentially, government does restrict some of our natural rights. Again, here in the United States, we do not have total liberty to do whatever we want. We can't just drive our car however we want. We can't just walk into other people's homes and start taking their stuff, you know, because laws exist against those things. So we do have restrictions against our natural rights here in the United States. Um, and again, we agree to those as part of the social contract so that we have a sense of safety and so that we then have access to civil liberties and civil rights. And so ultimately, civil liberties would be limiting government power. That includes things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, um, which basically block the government from doing certain things. You potentially might have someone in government who would want everyone to follow the same religion, but he or she can't force us to do that in the United States because the First Amendment says we have freedom of religion. So civil liberties ultimately limits government power. There are things that are built into our Constitution that say, hey, government can't touch this. Government has to respect this freedom or this liberty. So we're going to kind of take a deep dive into some of the amendments of the Bill of Rights in future Class Connects. As we wrap up for today, I kind of just want to quickly go through a couple of constitutional protections we have as Americans, certain things that the government has to respect or the government is not allowed to do. And we'll kind of talk about why some of these are important. So, the first is the concept of habeas corpus, which is a Latin phrase that roughly translated would mean that you have the body. And essentially what it means is that here in the United States, if a person ever gets arrested, they have the right to know why they're being arrested. What is the crime that they are being charged with? So that means, for example, if you ever felt like you were unfairly being arrested and held prisoner, but the police haven't told you what you're being charged with. There's not actually been a crime that you've been presented or accused of committing. You and your lawyer then would have the right to go before a judge and file a writ of habeas corpus, where the government would either have to provide a clear explanation for why are you being arrested, why are you being imprisoned, and if they can't provide that, constitutionally speaking, you would then have to be released. And so why might this be important? What potentially would be the issue if the government did not have to worry about habeas corpus? Yeah, Jorgen.
You would have people being falsely accused of everything. Oh, your hair color is a different color. You could basically imprison someone for basically anything, and that's not right. Is what
Yeah.
as the con. That's what the habeas corpus is kind of debating was like, oh, you put that person in jail. Okay, what's the reason? Oh, you don't have a reason. Let them go.
Yeah, exactly. If habeas corpus didn't exist, theoretically, it would allow government to just go around arresting whoever they wanted and throwing them in jail because they felt like it, which obviously would be a huge abuse of power. Um, so habeas corpus requires, government provide a reason or a justification for why it's arresting someone. Now, that doesn't mean that there still aren't issues, but obviously it would be a much worse situation if habeas corpus didn't exist at all. Yeah, exactly, Sam. So next we have a bill of attainder, which is unconstitutional in the United States. But a bill of attainder would be if Congress could pass a law saying these people are guilty and they need to spend 10 years in jail. Here in the United States, Congress is not allowed to do that. Congress can pass a law saying some sort of activity is illegal, but Congress cannot specifically pass a law saying, Jorgen broke the law and now needs to go spend 10 years in jail. And again, why might that be important? Why would we not want Congress to have that ability to kind of identify certain people or certain groups and impose a punishment on them? What are we maybe skipping along the way if Congress was able to just do all of that? Yeah, Jorgen.
We're basically skipping so many different steps. We're skipping the right to a free trial. We're skipping the trial. We're skipping the jury. We're skipping everything just to put them in jail and then keep them in jail. The government can't just go on and say every person who has ever read the Harry Potter books needs to go to jail. That would include lots of kids, and including myself. But like it would make it outrageous and impossible because you would have so many people in jail for no reason at all, basically for anything, like little reason. Oh, you have an air conditioner in your house. You can't do that. Go to jail. That's just outrageous, and which is I'm glad that this is prohibited in the U.S.
Yeah, me too. Because, right, it would be way too much power to give the legislative branch. If the legislative branch could just pass laws saying these people are guilty and they need to go to jail, well, we've skipped the entire criminal justice system. As Jorgen mentioned, there was never a trial. There was never a chance for a person to prove their innocence. And again, easily could be an abused power at that point, where Congress could just start, naming people they don't like and throwing them in jail because they don't like them or want to get rid of them. So the Constitution specifically prohibits Congress from doing that. Kind of on a similar note, Congress also cannot pass what are called ex post facto laws, which again is another Latin phrase, which means out of the aftermath. And what that essentially means is, again, yes, Congress can pass a new law saying, hey, this activity going forward is illegal. But what Congress cannot do is retroactively go back and punish people who did the activity before it was against the law. So an example of this, of kind of where it comes up, is, from time to time, new drugs are created. And when a drug is first created, there's no law, saying whether it's legal or illegal because it's brand new. So there's, you maybe have a couple of weeks where you can actually buy this new drug in stores because there's not yet a law that says it's illegal. But eventually, then, government comes together and says, okay, yes, this new drug is, concerning. It can be abused. We don't want people consuming it recreationally. It's illegal. But government can't then go back in time, essentially, and punish the people who were buying and using the drug in the past because, well, when they were doing it in the past, it was still legal. You can punish people moving forward if they continue to buy and use it. Um, but you can't go back in time and punish people for doing things that weren't illegal at the time they were doing it, which again would just be a huge abuse of government power if they could do that. And yeah, Jason, yeah, I've seen some concerning things about that. Another constitutional protection we then have is a jury trial. If a person is arrested and accused of, breaking the law, and it's a criminal offense, it's not just a small misdemeanor like a speeding ticket, the accused has the right to a trial by jury. Um, so, first off, just so we're all on the same page, what is a jury? What are we talking about when we're talking about a jury? Yeah, Jorgen.
Simple terms is it's basically a group of people who sit in seats and take notes during the whole procedure. Take notes during the whole trial and basically put them together, and basically tell them they have to decide if the person's guilty or innocent based on their notes that they're taking and the amount of um, resources and explanations that's been given out, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So a jury's made up of just everyday citizens. For example, once a person is 18, you can be selected for jury duty. You kind of get a notification in the mail, and that is a requirement of being a U.S. citizen. Is if you get called for jury duty, you have to serve. Although most of the times when you get the thing in the mail, it ends up not going to trial and you don't end up having to show up on the day of. But then you sit there throughout the entire trial, you listen to all the evidence that is presented, and then at the end of the trial, the jury meets and discusses and makes a final decision on, is the accused person innocent or guilty? Now, again, the jury's made up of everyday people. They're not lawyers. They're not legal experts. So why would the founding fathers want this? Why would we want just a group of everyday Americans to decide if a person is innocent or guilty? Why not instead have the judge make that decision? I mean, the judge theoretically is going to be a legal expert. Why would we want a group of everyday people to make that decision versus, a government official like a judge? Definitely, one concern would be the judge could have a bias, one way or another, on the person that's being accused, or the judge could be corrupt, and abuse that power of getting to decide who is innocent or guilty. By having a jury, typically of 12 people, yeah, they're probably all going to have some degree of bias because all people have biases, but, hopefully they're kind of balancing one another out. And because these are a group of just 12 everyday people, arguably also helps protect against corruption. This also means that ultimately it is never the government that gets to decide that you are guilty and need to be punished. That is a decision that only our fellow citizens can make against us. Um, Definitely, Sam. That is part of it as well. And so, again, having jury trials limits government power, because even if the government, is trying to throw all of its weight behind putting a person in jail for personal reasons, it is ultimately a jury that has to make that final decision, not the government. And so, theoretically, if government figures are abusing their power and trying to falsely put someone in jail, the idea would be that the jury would hopefully see that, and vote the person not guilty because a good case hasn't been presented. Now, again, no system is perfect. Ultimately, do innocent people get found guilty and go to jail? Yeah. But again, the idea is this hopefully protects against that better than if government officials themselves just got to decide who was guilty and went to jail. And so that is why we have jury trials in the United States, and why it's so important for people to serve on a jury if they get selected. But I see we're unfortunately out of time, so we will have to stop there for today. As always, if you have questions, stick around, let me know. Happy to answer them. Otherwise, you are good to go, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Would next time we meet, will we talk about limits to treason?
Yeah, we'll try to sneak that in right at the start of. Although, wait, Thursday I'm sending you guys a recording because it's an asynchronous day, so we may not get to it till Monday.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep.
I was just wondering because I don't have anything in my notes for limits.
Yep.
I do have things in my notes for the ones we talked about today.
And yeah, see you, Andy. See you, Noah. See you, Ira.